Dad, who did this?
Calm down, Caleb. It's just a misunderstanding. Everyone is fighting their own battles, son.
A thug slapped an 81-year-old veteran in a diner. Hour later, his son walked in with Hell's Angels. When Trevor Cole struck 81-year-old Earl Whitman in Maggie's diner, he thought he was teaching an old man a lesson. He had no idea Earl's son Caleb was riding with the Hell's Angels, and that true strength was about to reveal itself. Maggie's diner existed in the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone's business, where morning coffee came with side orders of gossip, and the worn linoleum floors had absorbed decades of conversations between neighbors who'd watched each other's children grow up. Red vinyl booths cracked with age-faced windows that looked out on Main Street's quiet desperation, where empty storefronts told stories of economic decline that left young men angry and old men invisible. Earl Whitman occupied his usual corner booth with the quiet dignity of someone who'd earned his place through service rather than demanding it through noise. At 81, he carried himself with the careful posture of a man whose spine had been straightened by military discipline and bent by 8 decades of life's accumulated weight. His Purple Heart pinned the only visible reminder of battles fought in jungles that younger generations knew only from history books. What the morning regulars couldn't see were the battles etched into Earl's patient eyes. 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat medic, 30 years teaching high school history to kids who thought respect was weakness, and 3 years since Martha's death, learning to exist without the person who'd made life worth living. Every morning, he ordered the same breakfast and left the same generous tip, treating Maggie and her staff with the courtesy that he believed separated civilization from chaos. Earl's challenge wasn't physical. His military pension provided adequate comfort. His battle was existential. How do you maintain dignity when society treats age as irrelevance? How do you model strength when the world mistakes kindness for weakness? He was fighting to matter in a culture that discarded experience while carrying hard-earned wisdom that younger generations desperately needed but rarely sought. Earl's Tuesday morning began like every other since Martha's funeral: coffee black, wheat toast with strawberry jam, reading yesterday's newspaper that Maggie saved specifically for him. He occupied booth 7 not from habit, but from strategy. Back to the wall, clear sight lines to entrances, habits learned in combat that civilian life had never quite erased. Trevor Cole's entrance disrupted the diner's peaceful rhythm like a stone thrown through still water. 23 years old and radiating the particular brand of anger that came from believing the world owed him opportunities he'd never worked to earn, Trevor brought with him the energy of someone looking for targets rather than solutions. "This place is full of losers," Trevor announced loudly, his voice pitched to ensure everyone heard his contempt for people whose only crime was existing without his permission. His eyes swept the room like a predator, evaluating prey, finally settling on Earl's quiet corner where dignity sat undefended by youth or size. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Earl murmured quietly, returning to his newspaper while hoping that silence would discourage confrontation. Thiet Lapke Hoch, The Escalation, 152. Trevor's approach to Earl's booth carried the swaggering confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for cruelty. His movements advertising violence, while his eyes searched for signs of fear that would justify what he'd already decided to do. "You reading about the good old days, Gramps?" Trevor sneered, sliding uninvited into the opposite seat. "When dinosaurs ruled the earth and old coots like you mattered?" Earl looked up from his newspaper with the measured calm that had once steadied wounded soldiers under fire, his eyes taking inventory of Trevor's posture, positioning, and emotional state with the automatic assessment that military training never fully abandoned. "Young man," Earl said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of classroom management and battlefield leadership, "everyone in this diner is fighting battles you know nothing about. Perhaps you'd find more satisfaction addressing your own struggles than creating new ones for others." The response was thoughtful, diplomatic, and completely wasted on someone whose entire identity depended on interpreting kindness as weakness rather than strength, choosing restraint over violence. Trevor's reaction to Earl's reasonable response revealed the insecurity that drove his aggressive behavior. When faced with actual wisdom and genuine strength, he doubled down on performance rather than reflection. "Did you just lecture me, old man?" Trevor's voice rose with the artificial outrage of someone whose ego couldn't tolerate being addressed as an equal rather than feared as a threat. "You think because you're ancient, you deserve some kind of special respect?" Earl folded his newspaper with the precise movements that military discipline had ingrained, his actions controlled and deliberate despite Trevor's escalating aggression. Every person in the diner was watching now, their conversations dying as tension filled the space between breakfast orders and morning coffee. "Respect isn't about age," Earl replied calmly, his words carrying the weight of 8 decades spent earning rather than demanding recognition. "It's about character, and character is revealed through how we treat people who can't fight back." The observation was accurate, compassionate, and about to trigger the violence that Earl's experience had taught him to recognize, but his principles wouldn't allow him to initiate. Trevor's facade of control began cracking as Earl's calm dignity exposed the hollowness of his manufactured superiority. The old man's refusal to be intimidated wasn't defiance. It was something worse: indifference to threats that Trevor needed to matter in order to feel powerful. "You think you're better than me?" Trevor demanded, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose entire worldview depended on others validating his importance through fear. "Sitting there like some kind of saint when you're just another useless old fool taking up space?" Earl's response demonstrated the difference between strength and aggression. "I think we're both human beings deserving of dignity, regardless of our ages or circumstances. The question isn't who's better, it's whether we choose to build each other up or tear each other down." Other diners shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the escalating tension while struggling with the moral complexity of intervention. Margaret Chin, the retired teacher in booth 3, wanted to speak up but feared becoming Trevor's next target. Joe Martinez, the construction worker at the counter, felt his hands clench with protective instincts that his practical mind warned against acting upon. Maggie Rodriguez, who'd owned the diner for 15 years, watched the confrontation develop with a particular dread that came from recognizing situations spiraling beyond control. Earl was not just her customer, but her friend, someone who'd quietly helped her through her divorce by listening without judgment and offering gentle wisdom when she'd needed guidance most. But Trevor represented the kind of customer who could destroy small businesses through online reviews, social media campaigns, or simple word-of-mouth destruction. Her practical mind calculated risks while her conscience demanded action, leaving her paralyzed between competing obligations. Young Amy Chin, Maggie's waitress and Margaret's granddaughter, moved closer to the phone behind the counter, her 19-year-old instincts telling her this situation would require police intervention. But Earl caught her eye and shook his head slightly, a gesture that said he could handle this, that calling for help would escalate rather than resolve the tension. The diner had become a theater where civilization itself was being tested, where the choice between comfort and courage would define everyone present. Trevor's final escalation came when Earl attempted to leave, sliding out of the booth with the deliberate movements that age and old injuries required. The sight of the elderly veteran trying to avoid rather than engage conflict triggered Trevor's most primitive instincts. "Don't you walk away from me!" Trevor shouted, grabbing Earl's arm with enough force to demonstrate his physical advantage while stopping short of assault that might bring legal consequences. "I'm talking to you." Earl's response revealed decades of experience managing volatile situations. "Son, everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about. Whatever's driving your anger, I'm not your enemy. Let me buy you breakfast, and maybe we can talk about what's really bothering you." The offer was genuine, compassionate, and completely incomprehensible to someone whose worldview required enemies to justify his anger. Trevor's confusion at being offered kindness instead of fear created the cognitive dissonance that pushed him toward the violence his insecurity demanded as proof of his relevance and power. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as the moment when they were forced to choose between complicity and courage, between personal safety and moral obligation. Earl stood facing Trevor with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life, while 30 other diners watched to see whether decency could survive in a world that increasingly rewarded cruelty over kindness. Trevor raised his hand, the motion slow enough for everyone to see what was coming, but fast enough to create the split-second decision point that would define not just Earl's morning, but everyone's understanding of themselves. Some battles, Earl knew from experience, couldn't be avoided through wisdom or diffused through kindness. They could only be endured with grace. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Earl said quietly, his final attempt to reach whatever humanity might exist beneath Trevor's performance of power. "But some battles choose us rather than the other way around." The words hung in the air like a prayer for understanding that was about to be answered with violence. Trevor's hand connected with Earl's cheek with a sound that cut through the diner's morning chatter like a gunshot. The slap wasn't delivered with maximum force. Trevor had enough self-awareness to avoid felony assault, but it carried enough violence to humiliate, enough disrespect to wound dignity more than flesh. Earl absorbed the blow without stepping back, his military training having taught him that showing pain only encouraged bullies while maintaining composure often ended confrontations faster than retaliation. The red mark spreading across his weathered cheek told the story of unprovoked aggression against someone whose only crime was existing peacefully in a space that Trevor had decided to claim through violence. The diner fell silent with the particular quiet that followed moral failures, where 30 witnesses realized they were complicit in an assault simply by allowing it to happen without intervention. Margaret Chen covered her mouth in horror. Joe Martinez half rose from his stool before sitting back down, and Maggie Rodriguez felt her hand shake as she realized her business had just become a crime scene. But Earl's response revealed the difference between defeat and dignity. He straightened his shoulders, touched his cheek briefly, and looked at Trevor with something approaching pity rather than anger. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Earl said quietly. "But some battles you choose, and some choose you. You just chose yours." Trevor's satisfaction at finally provoking a reaction was immediately complicated by Earl's unexpected response. Instead of the fear or anger that would have validated his actions, the old man showed something that made Trevor deeply uncomfortable. Disappointment rather than intimidation, sadness rather than submission. "Feel better now?" Earl asked, settling back into his booth with movements that demonstrated his refusal to be driven away by violence. "Did hurting an 81-year-old man solve whatever problems brought you here this morning?" The questions cut deeper than any physical retaliation could have, forcing Trevor to confront the reality of what he'd just done while surrounded by witnesses whose silent judgment was becoming audible disapproval. Amy Chen had her phone out now, recording the aftermath despite Earl's earlier signal for restraint. Margaret Chen finally found her voice. "Trevor Cole, your grandmother would be ashamed of what you just did." The comment revealed what Earl hadn't known. Trevor wasn't a stranger, but a local boy whose family connections made his behavior even more shocking to people who'd watched him grow up. His assault on Earl wasn't random violence, but the culmination of a young man's steady transformation from troubled teenager to dangerous adult that his community had failed to address. Trevor's moment of triumph was already curdling into something more complex as the reality of his actions settled over the diner like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but no one wanted to acknowledge. He'd gotten what he wanted: dominance through violence, attention through cruelty, but the cost was becoming visible in the faces around him. Earl remained in his booth, calmly finishing his coffee despite the red mark on his cheek, his refusal to be driven away by violence somehow more powerful than any retaliation could have been. His presence was becoming Trevor's punishment, a living reminder that dignity couldn't be destroyed through aggression. "Everyone needs to mind their own business," Trevor announced to the room, his voice carrying less conviction than his earlier taunts. But the diner's atmosphere had shifted from fear to something approaching collective courage, as if Earl's refusal to be broken had reminded others of their own strength. Outside, the rumble of motorcycle engines was growing louder, though no one yet understood the significance of that approaching sound. The motorcycle engines outside grew from distant rumble to immediate presence, their synchronized growl announcing arrivals that would shift the diner's power dynamic completely. Through the windows, customers could see leather-clad figures dismounting from machines that looked like weapons themselves, their movements coordinated with the precision that suggested this wasn't coincidental timing. Caleb Whitman pushed through the diner's front door with the controlled urgency of someone who'd received an emergency call, his Hell's Angels colors visible beneath the leather jacket that couldn't quite hide 45 years of military bearing inherited from his father. Behind him, 3 other riders entered with the quiet menace that came from men who'd learned violence as a profession rather than a performance. Earl looked up from his coffee cup to see his son's face, recognizing immediately that Caleb had learned about the incident through channels that moved faster than official reports in small towns where everyone knew everyone's business. "Which one of you touched my father?" Caleb's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, his eyes scanning the diner until they settled on Trevor, whose earlier confidence was evaporating like steam from fresh coffee. Trevor's transformation from aggressor to potential victim was immediate and complete. The young man who'd felt powerful enough to strike an elderly veteran suddenly faced the reality that actions carried consequences he hadn't considered, particularly when those actions involved family members of people whose friends wore patches that announced their willingness to resolve disputes through methods that legal systems preferred to ignore. "Dad, what happened here?" Caleb asked, his tone shifting to gentle concern when addressing Earl while maintaining the edge that warned everyone else of his capacity for violence. "Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about," Earl replied calmly, "including this young man who just learned that some battles choose you rather than the other way around." Trevor's earlier swagger had completely disappeared, replaced by the particular terror that came from realizing he'd picked a fight with someone whose family included people who settled disputes through methods that didn't involve lawyers or judges. The Hells Angels' reputation preceded them into every room they entered, and Trevor's limited imagination was supplying scenarios that made his assault on Earl seem like catastrophically poor judgment. "Look, I didn't know. I mean, it wasn't that serious," Trevor stammered, his voice climbing toward panic as he realized that explaining himself to angry bikers required different skills than intimidating elderly veterans. But Caleb's attention wasn't focused on Trevor. It was focused on his father, whose calm demeanor and red cheek told the story without requiring detailed explanation. The sight of Earl's injury triggered protective instincts that 45 years of military and outlaw experience had honed into dangerous precision. "Dad, say the word," Caleb said quietly, "and this problem disappears permanently." Earl's response demonstrated why respect was earned rather than demanded, why dignity trumped violence, and why true strength manifested through restraint rather than retaliation. Standing slowly from his booth, he placed a gentle hand on his son's arm and looked directly at Trevor with the same compassion he had shown throughout the confrontation. "Son," Earl said to Caleb, "everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about. This young man just learned that his battles have consequences he didn't expect. But adding more violence to violence never made anyone stronger. It just made them more afraid." To Trevor, Earl continued, "You wanted to teach an old man about respect through violence. Now you're about to learn about respect through seeing what happens when people actually care about each other. My son came here ready to defend me, but I'm asking him not to hurt you, not because you don't deserve consequences, but because mercy is sometimes stronger than revenge." Trevor's education in the difference between power and strength reached its conclusion as he realized that Earl's mercy was more devastating than any physical retaliation could have been. Surrounded by people whose love for Earl made them dangerous, Trevor discovered that his earlier show of dominance had actually revealed his weakness, while the old man's restraint had demonstrated real power. I'm sorry," Trevor whispered, the apology torn from someone who'd never learned to admit mistakes without threat of consequences forcing the acknowledgement. Earl nodded acceptance. Everyone deserves second chances, son. But second chances require first learning from first mistakes. You struck me because you thought I was weak and you were strong. But strength isn't about who can hurt whom. It's about who can choose not to hurt when they have the power to do so. Caleb helped his father gather his belongings while the other Hell's Angels maintained their presence as living reminders that Earl's mercy was a choice rather than weakness, that his forgiveness came from strength rather than inability to exact revenge. The diner watched in silence as 3 generations of different kinds of power, military discipline, outlaw loyalty, and youthful aggression, played out a lesson about respect, consequences, and the courage required to choose mercy over vengeance. Trevor left the diner without finishing his order, his departure witnessed by 30 people who had seen him transformed from aggressor to supplicant through the power of dignity combined with consequence. The red mark on Earl's cheek would fade, but the lesson about respect, family, and the difference between strength and violence would resonate through the small town's collective memory. Everyone's fighting battles you know nothing about, Earl told his son as they prepared to leave. But some battles teach us more about ourselves than others. Today, Trevor learned that actions have consequences, and I learned that mercy can be more powerful than revenge when it's backed by people who love you. Caleb nodded, understanding that his father had just demonstrated leadership that transcended both military command and outlaw intimidation. Months later, Trevor would seek out Earl to apologize properly and ask for guidance in addressing the anger that had driven his behavior. The diner installed a plaque honoring Earl's service, and Caleb's riding group adopted veteran support as their primary charity focus, understanding that protecting people sometimes meant creating consequences for those who threatened them. Earl continued his daily routine, his quiet dignity having taught an entire community that respect was earned through character rather than demanded through violence, and that true strength lay in choosing mercy when revenge was within reach. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from those who refuse to use their power, teaching us that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about. The strongest people are usually fighting battles you know nothing about. And sometimes those battles teach us that mercy backed by strength is more powerful than violence driven by weakness. Whether it involves elderly veterans choosing forgiveness over revenge while their biker sons demonstrate that love provides the best protection against cruelty.